Does everybody know Alix? Alix Jules is kind of special to us. He is one of our founding members, and I believe was our second ever executive director. Still very much involved in our organization. He and Zach were real instrumental in helping us kind of come up with this plan that we're all voting on today, so we really appreciate their continued involvement. Alix is a writer and an activist and a social critic and a commentator. He's based here in Dallas. His activism has garnered national attention on matters of race and religion and politics. He's been featured in various publications such as Ebony Magazine. He was the first atheist, I believe, that was discussed in that magazine. And interestingly enough, we got a message about 6 months ago from a black man who was soon to be released in prison. And of course, as prisons are, they have a bunch of old magazines, and this guy had bumped into an article about Alix and was wondering how he could get in touch with atheist organizations in his area. So we really appreciate the work that Alix does, because it's sometimes not real apparent the impact that you've had. And when you get a letter years after something appearing in a publication, you can then get a feel for how you've impacted some in your community. So we appreciate Alix and all that he does. Without further ado, Alix, if you'd like to come up and let's. Alix is going to talk to us today about race relations, and I'll let him introduce his own talk. Thank you, Alix.
Because that's why I am. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about race, reason, and discourse. It's activating humanism for social change. First, I got a couple of PSAs for you. First one is, the earth is still round. Recently, we had a basketball player, Kyrie Irving, who came out and said that there's actually no conspiracy whatsoever. It's settled. The earth is flat. So my first public services announcement is, you probably want to be skeptical of sports figures because they're also not educators. That's one. The second PSA I've got for you is very recent. Sweden is okay. They were not actually attacked, as our president said. There was no big, massive assault 2 nights ago in Sweden. So that's the second one. Sweden is okay. I've confirmed it, spoken to a couple of people, and they sent me a note saying, yes, they're fine. If you are political, this is my third one. SNL was a rerun last night, but they will be back next week. Okay, who is Alix? Well, I'll kind of talk a little bit about that, but as I was here last time, it dawned on me that a lot of you may not know who I am. It's been a while since we've seen so many new faces, but which is amazing. I'm a writer and an activist. I actually got my activism, or the start of my activism, here several years ago. I was interested in finding a place, a home, where I could bring my kids, bring my family, and connect. And we were close to having something like that, although there were some deficiencies in the last place we were. And several of our families got together and created the fellowship. And during the first few years of the fellowship, actually it was about the first year, my son, who is now 22, was one of the first kids in Camp Quest, Texas. And he had a little bit of a run-in in school. That particular summer, it's Camp Quest in Texas. The religious are going to be upset about it. In fact, the news that was coming out, although it was pretty cool, hey, you now have a skeptic-based camp. You had, and there was like one or two, there's only just a handful of protesters the first time. On the news, the narrative that was being pushed out there is the atheists are coming for your children. My son, who was a freshman in high school at the time, when asked by the news that was covering the story, they said, do we want to have an interview with one of these kids? And I said, sure. If he's up to it, if he wants to have this conversation, go do it. And he did, and it was wonderful. And it was one of those proud daddy moments. It was great, yay. And that was August. Now, before he did this, I said, there's a possibility that this comes back at you because we're in Texas. And we made it out of September, okay. October, not an issue. And I'm like, okay, it looks like we made it. And unfortunately, right around Thanksgiving, Christmas, a couple of children that happen to look like him, black kids, caught him in the corner, and they mentioned that they saw his interview at their church. It turns out that the church itself had used his interview as a form of recruitment and reinforcing a lot of these norms or the narrative that the atheists are coming for your kids. And one of the kids, actually two, but one of them, was very adamant that, hey, how in the world can you be an atheist? You are black. And there was enough for me to be angry about during that entire ordeal. But what it came down to for me is I want to be mad at these kids, but they don't know any different. They really didn't. When you take a look at the structural narrative, there aren't or weren't many black atheists. So I decided that I would have to find a way to become more visible, have conversations, and help change that narrative. So the birth of my narrative, my activism. That led me to various conversations with secular organizations, the press, et cetera. I began focusing on secularity or secularism, atheism, having discussions with the other side about where we were, not only in topics of race, but how do you define what black is? Black has never been a monolith. Historically, there have always been black freethinkers. We take a look at the civil rights movement itself, and you hear about people like Martin Luther King. It's the first person that pops into most people's heads, except when you take a look at A. Philip Randolph and several of the other support characters for the civil rights. Many of them were flat out atheist or secular, and that's what we weren't talking about. So the majority of my work tends to be discussing race, religion, and the intersection of American politics, because politics are a manifestation of culture. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the racial climate and racial norms, skeptical tools for empathy, and using humanism for social change. Now, we're going to talk about the persistence of racial norms, and then we're also going to talk about or discuss the realities of where we really are in race relations in the United States. Now, if you listen to the primary narrative, we're living in a post-racial America. Unfortunately, we're really not quite there yet. In fact, we're not where many of us think that we are in race relations. We've come a long way, but not as far as we would like to think. Optimism, diversity, empowerment, and minority engagement have helped move the country, but along the way it's been met with apathy, resistance, and policies either through implementation or design. If you don't take anything else from this talk, It's, I hope you take the ability to look at things critically while speaking with empathy. So one of the big polls that continues to shape the discussion on racial attitudes and the racial climate is this one, which yields a lot of interesting ideas of where we really are. And this one is the Pew survey. So 38%, excuse me, 38% versus 8% see significant difference in the view on equal rights. Blacks, far more than whites, say black people are treated unfairly across different realms of life, from dealing with the police to applying for loans or mortgage. And for many blacks, racial inequality remains an elusive goal. 88% say the country needs to continue making changes for blacks to have equal rights with whites, but 43% are skeptical that such changes will ever occur. And that's a grim view. An additional 42% of blacks believe that the country will eventually make the changes needed for blacks to have equal rights with whites, but just 8% of the country believes that it's actually made the necessary changes. White Americans, very different. 46% say that race relations are generally good versus generally bad. 2 to 1, blacks are more likely to say race relations are bad, so roughly 61% rather than good. About 4 in 10 whites, compared with the 22% of blacks, say that there's too much focus on race and racial issues. This is also echoed in various surveys, various news outlets as well, where you see that roughly half the country, if not more, believes that we have a racial divide. And then looking at how it plays out in interpersonal relationships and the acceptance of, this is actually a really wonderful scale of where we're going, but where we're not. And if you look at the numbers, roughly 13% of America's, and you have to remember what the demographics are, only 13% of America is black. Only 30%, roughly 80% of Americans will overestimate that number to be about 30. It's only 13%. But roughly 13%, only 13% of America, 13% of America is not okay with interracial marriages. Okay? That's actually kind of telling. .538 did a study that was pretty interesting when it talked about, when we're trying to compare where we really are in anti-black sentiment, when we start talking about what progression really is, what it looks like. And one of the big questions that we've used since 1938 actually is who's holding you back? And again, you see a really big difference between black and white respondents, where you're looking at discrimination, inborn ability, lack of motivation, et cetera. It's getting better, but we're not there yet. An AP poll in 2012, and we're expecting the numbers for 2016 to be released later on this year, show roughly 51 to 56% of Americans have what we call anti-black or explicit racial bias. They have a problem. They have a problem with black people. Okay, and the common belief is that, well, just give it a little bit of time, and it's just going to get better year over year with year over year as the generations become less racist. However, the problem is it's not going away at the rates that we thought or projected that they would. So you're only seeing, let's see, for the millennials, we're only seeing 1 to 3% change from their parents in explicit bias. But why? I almost, every time I talk about this, I have to give new context, specifically because people have a very narrow view of history. America has been racist for a very long time. And this isn't an anti-American speech, it's just the reality. 1619, and it's not only anti-Black, this is just truly racist. The lands were conquered and founded on some form of racism. Native Americans were forced to serve Columbus. Native Americans were ripped apart by attack dogs and fed to many of the conquerors' dogs specifically. Native Americans were used to mine golds and had a quota, and those who didn't make quota had their hands cut off and bled to death. The mass extermination of the Native Americans under Columbus's rule was one of the more horrifying pieces of our history. And we also did not want to convert Native Americans to Catholicism because at the time, you could not enslave Catholics. So that was actually withheld. Of course, we had the first African Americans, slaves that were brought to the US in 1619. The Japanese American internment camps through executive order started in 1942. So America has this very long history of this. Invariably, I will hear the comment that racism just doesn't exist anymore, and my ancestors didn't have slaves. Yeah, true, but racism evolved, it changed. President Obama, a few years ago, actually addressed this, when he said, we're not cured of it, and it's not just a matter of it not being polite to say the N-word in public. That's not the measure of whether racism still exists or not. It's not just a matter of overt discrimination. Societies don't overnight completely erase everything that happened 200 to 300 years prior. And it's true. It became very casual. Now, if you're not familiar with the term casual racism, I did speak about this before, it involves negative stereotypes or prejudices about people on the basis of race, color, or ethnicity. Some of the examples are, jokes, offhanded comments, and exclusion of people from social situations on the basis of race. Casual racism is racism hidden in conversations that uphold stereotypes and stigmas without challenge. It is the glue that keeps bigotry thriving. We kind of see that played out, and I call it the name game. But if you remember, a few years ago, UCLA researcher Dr. Connor Holbrook published a paper in the Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior discussing the impact of names and bias. The participant sample, despite being slightly left of center politically, automatically attributed violence to individuals based solely on having names like Darnell or Juan, whereas names such as Connor automatically led to expectations of prestige and status. This seems to clearly echo the fear of Black and Latino men in our society, which is ironic, the study states, given who actually who is afraid of them. In a similar study with Harvard, researchers found that white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks during jobs. About 1 in 10 resumes with a white-sounding name received callback compared to 1 in 15 with a black-sounding name. The racial bias in response cut across all industries from fast food to accounting. Even companies that advertise themselves as equal opportunity employers discriminated at roughly the same rate. Here's the thing, no one's ever racist. Philip D. Ray titled his seminal history paper, "Lynching at the Hands of Persons Unknown," because most investigations of lynching in the South turned up no actual lynchers. No one lynched, although we have the evidence that people were being lynched. David Duke and George Wallace both insisted that they were not racist. Now, if you know David Duke, he is the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and George Wallace, former governor, he might as well have been. But I think it talks to a lot of the constant denial of where we are in discourse on this topic. George Bush, in his memoir, Decision Points, he considered being called a racist his most painful memory as president. Wasn't the Iraq War. It wasn't any of those other decisions that cost lives. He didn't like being called a racist. Okay. There are a lot of reinforcements of bias, and some of it is biological. I'm not trying to create an excuse for racism because we know that we can overcome some of them, but this seems to be, or appears to be, what the current leading contributors that we study in sociology and psychology show us. Social reinforcement, the media, lack of exposure, and then biology itself. So when people tell me, no, I'm colorblind, my first response is, what do you do at a stoplight? The second one is when they say, I'm not racist. Like, how did you escape that? How did you truly escape that? In a 2000 study led by Liz Phelps, a cognitive neuroscientist at NYU, she suggested that the amygdala, a brain region involved in fear processing and the fast automatic thinking system, drives racial bias. Among other things, the amygdala guides behavior by forming associations between experiences and unpleasant reactions. It also generates the emotional reactions to words, sights, or ideas you find unpleasant. To see if the amygdala was involved in racial bias, Phelps devised a simple experiment. She showed 12 white undergraduate pictures of faces of black and white male strangers while they were in an MRI. She also measured racial bias using a test designed to root out implicit, unspoken opinions that someone may suppress for fear of appearance. In the test, subjects categorized words such as good, joy, love, peace, or bad, cancer, death, war, at the same time that they categorized the faces they saw in the MRI machine as black or white. Left button for good white, right button for bad black. In the other half, the pairing switched and they used the same responses for good and black. Left for good black, right for bad white. Someone with greater racial bias finds the task harder when good is paired with black, and it takes them longer to press the correct button during these trials. You can look up this study. Bias is how much longer someone takes on good black compared to good white. The participants with stronger racial bias also had the most activation in their amygdala when viewing black faces compared to viewing white faces. The same people who were the slowest at responding when black was paired with good had the greatest amygdala activation when viewing black faces. All right, so these results suggest that of the two systems of thinking, fast automatic processing is more involved in racial bias. They also explain why bias stubbornly persists even if our cultural mores tell us it's wrong. Negative thoughts crop up automatically before we're consciously aware of them, so tamping them down requires extra mental effort. In the study, they introduce now this is where it gets interesting. In the study, they introduce propranolol to affect subconscious bias. The males who took propranolol showed significantly less subconscious bias. Now, propranolol is a tool that's used in treating PTSD. On the test, the group that took placebo took over 1.5 seconds longer on average to press the button for black good compared to white good. So we as humans are capable of the bias, but actively have to work on suppressing the bias. The problem in escaping it is you deal and live in a country where media reinforces it. This actually makes a lot of sense when dealing with police, because the amygdala is the first thing that is activated when interacting with minorities and guns are used or present. So them trying to actively suppress the non-shoot fight or flight emotion is extraordinarily difficult for them to overcome. So when we have these discussions about there's no bias in policing, well, there's bias in being human. So how does it not translate into policing? Okay. Now with that, these topics are usually really hard to talk about, but I want to give you all a handful of tools that you can use in having these discussions. First thing that I need you to remember is facts matter, but so does context. Sources matter. Be really careful of fake news. Remember that sensationalism equals ratings, and every observer brings bias. Just like when dealing with your political rivals or religious opponents, also remember that emotional arguments are not equal to rational debate. And also be really careful about your own reaffirming bias. Let me give you an example. All right, so former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee stated, if we have a shooting, we end up assuming that it had to be racial. When in fact, as we know, more white people have been shot by police officers this year than minorities. Now, anybody care to address why this is wrong? One word answer. Math. Of course, you would expect there to be more white shot by police officers. There are more white people than there are black. Blacks only make up 13% of the US population. So, when looking at this particular source, we have to say, is there any form of sensationalism? Are there motives that are driving this particular discussion or this assertion? And in context, what does it actually mean? Well, like I said, there are 160 million more whites than there are blacks. So you would expect that number. But when he's using it to take the fangs out of many of the real implications that we see in policing and police interaction with minorities. Blacks are shot nearly twice as much, or twice as often, more than whites when corrected for population. I'll give you another one. Now this is an associate in Toronto who made a statement that is getting very popularized right now. Police are hunting black men in the streets. And that's BLM Toronto. Well, let's take a look at that. Who is the source? And is there a sensational motive? Of course there is, because that particular movement in itself is trying to build on an emotional reaction to get some form of change. It becomes an emotional debate. But in context, is there anything that we can derive that makes sense to us as skeptics. It's actually really very complicated in the US since we don't have a good form or source or primary data. The federal government wasn't actually tracking this information officially until the previous administration said that it would, and then unfortunately that project stopped. So we have to rely on secondary and tertiary data through the press. Because everything else that was being reported was based on voluntary surveys by police. It turns out that police don't commit crimes or aren't incapable of bias is what we're finding outside of the DOJ coming in and having real discussions. Now this is also a very interesting piece. Perception is not reality, and sometimes perception is greater than reality. Now, about 3 in 10 adults estimate that police fire their weapons a few times a year while on duty. And more than 8 in 10, 83%, estimate that the typical officer has fired his or her service weapon at least once in their career outside of firearms training on a gun range. This surprises everyone when I show it. Only 27% of all officers say they have ever fired their service weapon while on the job. Ever. One of the other things that we also hear is talk about the militarization of police and where we're going to place enhanced policing. The issue there is an underlying narrative that military-trained vets are less likely to have those kinds of negative interactions with minorities because of the de-escalation training that they're given. Unfortunately, that's actually not what we're finding. Turns out, you can see up there, when it comes to, let's see, where is it? Creating a federal database, they tend to be very pro-gun, and I think it was, there we go, they tend to fire their guns significantly more than police officers who haven't been in the military. Use skepticism. However, when you have these conversations with people, and of course this audience is predominantly white, it always is predominantly white. This is the case nationally, where we see 95%. The majority of my audience is 90+% white. So you taking these conversations and having them with minorities and minority communities is important, but if you're coming from a place of, I got facts, but you have no context, and you don't have all the facts, then you're gonna find yourself in a world of hurt really quick. I'm constantly tagged in arguments on social media, like, help, I got myself stuck. Yes. It's really, yeah, you did. Now read, it's like, oh yeah, you did. You stepped in it. We saw it with Bill Maher and Milo as well. He stepped in. Anyway, but one of the pieces that tends to be missing with the hyper-rational is this idea of empathy. And you can actually bring intellectual empathy to the table with you. There's a wonderful book out there by a colleague. It's called Intellectual Empathy, and it talks about how you can use these facts still and leave them on the table, and then look at perspective in trying to have real conversations. That's the only real way that this is going to change. Any change is going to occur. There's also a big difference in the way that black parents and white parents approach the topic of race. 80 to 90% of black parents talk to their children about race. This is institutional racism, their relationships, actual racism, and historical racism. This is not off the table, compared to only 40% of white parents that ever do it. And when they do it in the context of, not kidding, don't be racist. That's about it. Don't be racist. Don't treat other people differently because of their color. That has translated to almost a discussion that is almost insurmountable when doing the false equivalence thing. It's like, everyone's racist, and look, okay, yeah, everyone can be racist, and we've established that. Where now 30% of white Americans, 30% is the number, 30% of white Americans believe that they are being oppressed. They feel as if they have been discriminated against by 13% of the population. How does that happen? Okay. What? I didn't say anything. I'm playing with fire. So this is where we are now. I could get y'all in a lot of trouble. So I'm going to stay away from this, but this is our reality now. We have someone who is going after the national endowments, and the national endowments have significant impact on minority education. He's already said that he wants to abolish the Office of Community Policing and wants to give asset forfeiture rights back to police. We need more police, less training, more guns. That's where we are. That little one right there, that little me-looking person right there is my 5-year-old. But right next to her is not her mom, it's not a relative. Anybody know who that is? Look close. Look close. Nothing? There you go. So, I had an opportunity to sit down with Ruby. Her name is Ruby Bridges. She's got a fascinating story. A lot of people have seen the movies, read the books, etc. And this was a little girl who was chosen, and she was actually chosen, there were 6 of them that were chosen, to challenge Louisiana when it came to desegregation. Brown versus Board had already already been won, and the Louisiana governor, was not okay with the idea of integration. So he set up a couple of hurdles, and the school, but it was going to be enforced, period. The NAACP decided that they were going to challenge it, and they were going to see if they can actually test it. Could we get black children into white schools? Could we integrate? They decided that they were going to go into Louisiana, where it was probably okay. It was going to happen, except you had a school district that was anti-integration. The school chancellor said, if you can give us children, black children, who can pass these various tests, you've got to prove that they're smart enough to be with white children, we will do 2 pilots to see if it works. First one included Ruby, and there was supposed to be 6. 5 of the children's parents backed out. Then there was the McDonough 8. There was another school that sent their kids over there as well. Now, how this occurred is actually fascinating. There was an announcement that black children were going to go to these schools. So you had parents that were getting up with picket signs, ready to protest everywhere in Louisiana, everywhere. They didn't know where. This was New Orleans, so they were just there. And Ruby is that little girl there, decides, okay, they don't announce where she's going to be, and she walks into the school, and there are only a few picketers there. She walks all the way through, and she's escorted by 4 U.S. Marshals, goes into the school, and is escorted into the principal's office. And as these parents see what's going on, it's like, this is it, this is the place. Ruby talks about seeing a wave of white parents just running into the school. And a few minutes later, as she's sitting there watching what's going on, every student is being emptied out. All of them. They're just gone. So day one, she's the only kid in she's the only kid in the school. She didn't know what was going on. She didn't know that her being black had anything to do with any of this. She's 5. She comes back the next day, and she's escorted to the principal's office again. Again, she just sits there, and no one is taking care of this girl. She's just sitting in the back. And it turns out that no teacher in the school district wanted to teach her. So they actually didn't have anyone. They flew someone in from Boston to do this teaching, and she was picked out from one of the president's cabinet members. Shows up, and she sees that this child has no teacher, and it's like, wait, you can't integrate in a school and not actually teach. This is the whole purpose of a public school. You have to teach. And so she comes back, and she's escorted to her classroom. And she is taught by this wonderful woman. She happened to be white and had this deep Bostonian accent. And she's there, and she keeps coming back day after day after day. And they create this wonderful, beautiful bond that still exists today. It's actually a wonderful story. But she talks about how about halfway through the year, she had been hearing these voices. And it turns out that there were a handful of children that were still in the school, but they were segmented, walled away, and the principal had dictated Ruby was never to interact with them. So finally the teacher convinced them, hey, okay, maybe we won't get them in the same class, but Ruby knows what's going on, and as soon as the president finds out about this, you've integrated a school, technically, but you haven't integrated the classroom, which is the essence of that law. So they were allowed to play in the backyard. They can play on the schoolyard. They could not be in the same classroom, but he allowed them to play in the schoolyard. And she walks up to one of these little boys, and she's talking to them, and she says, "Oh my God, can we be friends? I want to play with you." And he looks up at her and says, "My mama told me not to play with niggers." And it was right then that she realized exactly what this entire thing was about. And there was no hate, because she said flat out, well, I would have listened to my mom too, because you're 5. Okay? She got to play with them pretty often, pretty regularly, but she had her own teacher. She had to bring her own lunch, because during one of those walks, one of the marshals overheard one of the parents scream out, "I'm going to poison that nigger." And so they took that as a credible threat, where Ruby would come in and she would tell the story of, "I smelled food. It's like, it smells like wonderful food, and I'm tired of these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches," but it was a safety concern. Okay. Now, she eventually finished out the year. It was a beautiful year for her. She said she learned more that year than she can remember, and she had this wonderful relationship, this wonderful friendship. It was just her and this one white teacher. The interesting part of her story isn't even year one that is always spoken about. It's year two. And I think year two talks a little bit more about where we are with race relations in the US. And that is, she walks into school day one, year two. Nothing ever happened. She walks into a class with the teacher that refused to teach her the previous year, no acknowledgement of what happened. These kids, of course, she dealt with the racial slurs, etc. And she was treated badly, but it was the 60s. But no acknowledgement of anything that ever happened, because none of the parents were racist. None of the children were racist. None of the teachers were racist. So when we talk about post-racial America, and I look back at that very particular specific time in American history, and I look at this picture and I'm like, wow, that's a long time ago. That was a really, really, really long time ago, because that's what we're told. That happened a long time ago. Ruby Bridges is only 20 years older than I am. Those races haven't died off yet. This was a really, really long time ago. Brown versus Board happened a really, really long time ago. Last year, in Mississippi, the District of Columbus was ordered by a federal judge to desegregate. Just about 30 days ago, they decided that they weren't going to fight it. Only 30 days ago. So that's kind of where we really are with racial discourse in America. So if I'm going to urge you to do anything, is to center yourself around where we really are, cut through the optimism, the fluff. If we're going to build these bridges and we're going to do it together, we have to first start with honesty. Thank you very much.